Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And I'm so happy to have Joann here with us today. So just a quick background. Joann and I met right before September 11th, and she was doing a column about networking, and we have been friends and fans and helping each other out ever since. And when she wrote me and said she was going to be publishing a book, I said, I can't wait to jump and help out. So Joann is a very accomplished writer for the Wall Street Journal, excuse me, and she's run a Pulitzer Prize and earned her bachelor's degree at Northwestern and a master's degree at Stanford, and she now lives in New Jersey and works in New York. Welcome, Joann. I lost Joann.
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay. Oh, gotcha. I hear you now. Okay, good. So welcome, Joann.
I'm very happy to be on this webinar. Thank you.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. So one of the things that I find is so interesting is, like, why did this book come to be? How did you decide that the world needed this book? And why did you write it?
Well, I wrote this book in order to give back to the women in my daughter's generation. My daughter is a millennial, and the kernel of the idea grew out of a first-person essay I wrote for a Wall Street Journal blog back in 2008. The essay was called Remember the Barriers, and it looked back at some of the early experiences I had had when I first entered the journalism profession, joining the Wall Street Journal right after graduate school. It got so much positive feedback and so many emails from women who had also had a difficult time being accepted as a female professional that it just made me wonder, as someone who writes about management and men and women in management, whether there were high-ranking corporate executive women who had also overcome career obstacles of one kind or another and had become better leaders as a result. So that was sort of the genesis for the book.
Can you talk a little bit more about career obstacles? What are some patterns that you see from your viewpoint? What do you hear when you're out on the road?
Well, I frankly learned a lot about career obstacles from reporting the book. And what was originally a fairly narrow focus, which was how did these 52 women who I interviewed deal with gender bias, quickly became clear to me that men and women alike all have to learn how to deal with career obstacles of a variety of kinds. And so these 52 women, nearly 2/3 of whom are experienced public company CEOs, talked about not getting their foot in the door when they first got out of college, not getting the job of their dreams, having difficulty getting picked for their first promotion, moving into management, suffering setbacks midway through their careers, where in some cases they got dismissed, they got laid off, let go, because they weren't performing. And at the same time, dealing with resistance from men either who had never worked for a woman or had once worked for a woman and didn't like the experience. So those were some of the career obstacles that the women I interviewed encountered and that I talk about in the book.
So was there an obstacle that surprised you, or was it pretty much what you expected?
I think the obstacle that surprised me the most was that these women who had all achieved very high levels in major corporations actually in some cases had gotten fired, because you always think of that as being sort of the be-all, end-all defining experience of one's life that it's really hard to bounce back from and kind of somehow brands you with the scarlet letter F for having been fired for the rest of your life. And so to me, their resiliency, their ability to cope and either get over the obstacle or figure out a way around it, whether it was getting dismissed or anything else, frankly, I found that most surprising, but it was clearly then one of their formative leadership traits. And what they did was that then they said, okay, what do I do differently going forward?
Fascinating. For those of you just joining us, I'm speaking with Joann Lublin from the Wall Street Journal. about her book called Earning It. Joann, you mentioned that millennials were part of the inspiration. What are you hearing from millennials as they respond to the book?
Well, it's interesting. There are a fair number of millennials at some of the speaking engagements where I talk, and what they are talking about is the fact that they were surprised that everything wasn't perfect at the point when they joined the workforce. Of course, I had the same misimpression myself. And then they go forward to share stories about how a lot of the issues that these women have dealt with over the decades are still present in the workplace for them, whether it's not being taken seriously as a woman, whether it's not being paid fairly, or whether it's even sexual harassment. Unfortunately, all those issues remain alive and well and are issues that millennials continue to deal with, as well as the issue of how to be part of a two-career couple. I added a chapter after the fact. It wasn't part of my original book plan, but I ran into so many women that I interviewed in the book who were part of career couples that I decided to add a chapter about that. And yet there have been studies, as recently as 2 years ago, published in the Harvard Business Review, in which they surveyed Harvard graduates with MBAs. And the very youngest men had many more traditional career expectations than their female counterparts. Half of the millennial men in this study that was published 2 years ago anticipated that their careers would take priority over their wives' careers. But 3/4 of the millennial women said that they thought their career should be at least as important as their partners. And the authors of that article in December 2014 said, "We do not know yet how these mismatched expectations will ultimately play out. But if previous generations are any indication, change won't occur soon." So to me, that has been one of the more gratifying as well as dispiriting reactions I've gotten, that as much as things have gotten better for women, we still have plenty of progress to go. And frankly, it's why so many people seem to enjoy the book.
As you met these women, well, first of all, I'm a good networker, but boy, you're the ultimate. How meeting these women, had they been in your columns before? Do you stalk them? What are some different ways that, you reach out to these people, stay in touch, and have them return your phone call?
Well, obviously not everybody returns my phone call. I ended up connecting and doing on-the-record interviews with 52 women, of whom a half a dozen were ones who I spoke with during the process of trying to put together book proposals. So, I actually started interviewing these women back in 2011, way before Sheryl Sandberg's book came out. Some of the women were women I have indeed written career columns about or done manager features about. In one case, I wrote about this woman for the first time in the late 1970s. That was Chalice Lowe when I was in our Chicago bureau. So she and I go way back. In other cases, women I interviewed for the book opened doors to other women and said, I'm on the board of so-and-so's company and she's the CEO. Would you like to talk to her as well? A couple of these women I knew had written books about their own careers. And so to me, that was a natural segue to say, I'd like to interview you for my book. I obviously want you to go beyond what you've written about, but there were at least 3 or 4 women who've written books about themselves. Kathy Black, for instance, wrote a book called Basic Black. 2 or 3 others did books. And then, of course, when I interviewed them, I asked them to go far beyond what they had talked about. Carly Fiorina wrote a book about her career. And in fact, Meg Whitman in her book doesn't share with readers of her memoir about the fact that she got fired from her first CEO job. She just says, it was a difficult job or something to that effect. But in the interview with me, she admitted publicly the first time that she had been fired.
I've been fired. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's happened to me. I owned some of the mistakes that I made, but you know, I'm in some cases I'm mindful of coming from Indiana, you know, that if you're there's some line about, you know, if you're driving too slow, you're not feeling terrified, you're not driving fast enough or something like that. I mean, you know, men seem to be able to push it and either get by with it, or when they get fired, they get picked up by a buddy from the club, you know, or the golf course. You know, is there a more of a stigma for women to be fired, or?
Well, I think there's more. I think there's much more attention to women, particularly when they get to be CEOs. The Rockefeller Foundation released a report only a few weeks ago, which looked at media coverage of companies when they were in crisis. And they found that many, many more companies that were being led by women, the media coverage talked about the CEO and the role that the CEO played in running the company than they did when a man ran the company. And so, in effect, we're essentially hoisting the women on their petard, making them the scapegoat for whatever crisis the company was in. So I think particularly when women get into senior and highly visible positions, they're still a rarity, and therefore they are held to greater scrutiny. I talk about the notion that you operate in a glass house, particularly when you're a CEO, but the glass house is many stories taller when you are a female CEO. But by the same token, the women who I write about in the book who did get laid off in their careers, it did happen relatively early in their careers. They weren't yet CEOs of major multi-billion-dollar public companies. In Meg's case, she was CEO of FTD, which is the well-known provider of floral products. But it was at a point when it had just gone from being a cooperative and purchased by a group of investors who wanted to turn it into a for-profit business before taking the company public. So it was definitely not on anybody's radar screen. And the other example in the story was a woman who was CEO of a business unit of a larger company. And again, yes, it was very humiliating for her. Her local newspaper covered her dismissal as head of Kentucky Fried Chicken. But she also, again, took lessons and figured out ways to recover from that setback.
What are some of the lessons that either she learned or you observed in interviewing these women on recovering from being fired or any setback?
Well, I think the biggest lesson that they learned is that it is not the end of the world, but that they need to be fairly strict, and this was particularly true for Cheryl Batchelder, at examining what it was that they had done and what it was that they could do differently going forward. And in her case, she takes over the command of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants at a point when the company was not doing very well. She was the first woman president of that business unit. It was owned by a larger company called Yum Brands. She knew it was in trouble. They were having declining sales, declining profits, bad relationships with their franchisees. But these were all things that she thought she knew how to fix because she had had extensive marketing experience at other food companies. But what she didn't know was it's very different being the head of a business unit of a major publicly held company where you're essentially judged on how well you do things on a very short-term basis. She thought she would have a couple of years or multiple years to turn it around. And in fact, things were going pretty well at first because she put in some new ads, put in some new products, but then they hit unexpected firestorm. They got very bad press coverage over lawsuits that were linking fast food to obesity. She also was diagnosed with breast cancer 8 months after she arrived and worked through her treatment. But as she said in the book, she said very soon, because of all these things that were happening with the brand, she said, everything I touched turned to mud. And so at age 47, in September of 2003, the chief executive of the parent company, says to her, this is not working out, and we're going to make a change, and fires her. And she was not only embarrassed, but hurt. She was saddened. The next day's newspaper in Louisville had her photograph, and it was under the headline, Cheryl Batchelder replaced. And her kids had to see this at school. She called it a really ugly day. But what was critical to her recovery from the setback, as well as to her future career success, was that it completely and profoundly changed her leadership style. She then later becomes CEO of Popeyes Louisiana Kitchen in 2007. Again, first woman CEO of that restaurant chain. Comes in and hears the same story again, bad relations with the franchisees, weak sales. But now she had learned from getting fired. She understood a publicly held company not only must perform well every quarter, but to the extent there's a long-term strategy, everybody's got to be on board with it. But more importantly was the empathy that she had learned to be a more empathetic leader. She understood what happens when somebody gets laid off. And so she changed how she hands out pink slips. And she tried to a much greater degree than ever before to treat people who were getting fired with greater dignity.
Now, is that because she was doing a downsizing, or she was needing to let poor performing people go?
Well, in her case, she also had to turn around the company, and she had to cut costs, and she had to revitalize the brand. And so, yes, she was having to make some painful cuts. But not only did she turn around the company, but I also thought that the quote she gives to me that I use in the book is very powerful. She said, this success story, talking about Popeyes, which, by the way, saw a 190% gain in its share price by March 2014. She said, this success story would not exist without KFC. She said, you have to be humbled, and you have to find the better rules to lead by. The leadership rules that I now know to be phenomenally effective came from what did not work.
Interesting. For those of you who are on the call with us, please feel free to write any of your questions in, and we'll be sure to see if we can get them over to Joann during the conversation. Joann, one of the things that, I found in reading the book, and I'm not surprised, you're an amazing writer, but was just, I kept wanting to wait for the next story. How do you, when you're writing, and particularly about something so passionate, know when to rein it in? I wanted to read the second version, the next one.
Well, obviously, as a journalist, and in this case, as a book author, you're going to accumulate a huge amount of information. I do that in reporting stories. I certainly did that in reporting this book. At the end of the day, I only included the stories that I thought were not only the most dramatic, but the ones that were most illustrative of the larger point I was trying to make. And that's also why the way the book is set up is, I think, particularly useful for women and men at any stage of their career. Every one of the key chapters is bookended at the end of that chapter with leadership lessons that are relevant to these incredibly dramatic and powerful stories you've just read. And so at some of the events I have spoken at, I've said, I know you're very busy people. If you really just want to figure out what this means for you career-wise, you could just read the leadership bullet points at the end of every chapter. But frankly, it's just, both inspirational as well as depressing and uplifting to read the actual tales that I'm hoping people will read more than the leadership lessons.
Yeah, well, having read it fast after getting it from you, I can definitely say it's a great holiday gift, and I would encourage people to swing by their local bookstore or, go online. But obviously, if you're going to support the community, why not do that? Joann, what some other things that, when you were meeting these women, any specific stories that you can share that help explain the importance of, external networking and mentorship?
Sure. So I devote an entire chapter to that very topic. It's, got a general title called Male Mentors Mean Business, but it's a lot broader than that. And it focuses on the importance throughout one's career of finding not only mentors who can informally advise you and guide you, but more importantly, finding powerful sponsors who can act as your advocate and door opener. And a sponsor, unlike a mentor, is someone who is willing to stick his or her neck out and do their best to make sure you land a better job. And they're willing to risk their scarce professional capital, professional reputation on vouching for you. And I think a really good example of that involved Mary Barra. Would you like to hear that story, Diane?
I love that. I love that.
So Mary Barra, as we all know, is now chief executive of General Motors, the biggest car maker in the United States. But, obviously didn't get there just by waking up one day and getting tapped on the shoulder in 2014. And in fact, what she talked about to me was how that internal sponsors were endorsing her for what she called stretch assignments because they knew she was someone who was passionate about getting results and who had proven themselves. Because that's the other thing. Sponsors do not want to take on a protege who they don't think already has potential or who hasn't already demonstrated some evidence that they will achieve great things. So in Mary's case, in 1997, there were a few male vice presidents for whom she had already worked at GM. And unbeknownst to her, they were lobbying privately on her behalf because they had heard that the CEO and the vice chairman were looking for someone with operational experience to be a job called their executive assistant. And at GM, the executive assistant to the CEO was a role reserved for rising young stars. It gave them a chance to acquire a much broader experience and also, more importantly, deal with the top brass in a way they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. And certainly given where Mary was in her career progression, she would never have had that kind of opportunity. At that point, she was only 35 years old, and she was the very bottom rung of the executive ranks at GM. She was working in a tech center. She was overseeing production processes and launches of cars at assembly plants that were building mid-sized cars. But she had no idea that she had been recommended for this high-level position of being an advisor to the CEO and the vice chairman. One day she comes back from lunch and she discovers a voicemail on her phone. Someone in HR left her a message inviting her to interview for this position. Well, this was so far removed from anything she could possibly imagine for herself that she figured some of her colleagues were playing a prank on her. And so she remembered, so Mary remembers thinking to herself, I'm like, ha, 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 who's playing a joke on me? Well, it turned out nobody was playing a joke on her. There were sponsors in the company, and again, these were men who had her as one of their direct reports before who were vouching for her. And so she confirmed that it was actually a legitimate call with her boss, and she did get chosen as the executive assistant to the CEO, and she remained in that position until 1999, and she was able to work alongside these two high-level executives, one of whom was the highest one, and it became for her a pivotal assignment. She got to learn about the company on a global basis, and in 2008, based partly on what she had learned from being in that role, she became a corporate vice president for the first time. And so she said to me that you need, as an ambitious woman, to find bosses who are willing to take chances on you, and even either while they are your boss or later when they're no longer your boss, to sponsor you because they recognize your achievements and your hard work. But then she added, and I think this is a particularly useful leadership lesson, if you are not working for somebody that you respect as your leader, then I would look to find a new position, she said.
Interesting. At the Vistage Summit in Boston recently, the speaker was the CEO, former CEO of Boeing and Ford, and he just talked about the importance of leadership and why CEOs matter. And you want to talk a little bit about, you've mentioned men in here a couple of times. What is the role of men? Sometimes I think this can get skewed so that it's like a chick party and the men feel left out.
Well, it's really interesting because a number of the speaking engagements I'm doing, the men are in the clear minority. They'll be this week in Detroit, 90 people in the room and 2 guys. Or when I spoke at a law firm a few weeks ago, over 100 people in the room, and I think there were, maybe 3 guys. And the men, when they ask questions, talk about the discomfort they feel at being a minority, and that their eyes are kind of opened up to what many of the women in the room had experienced about being the only woman at a meeting or one of 2 women in a large meeting. And to them, it's a pretty mind-boggling experience. I've gotten a very similar reaction to a number of male acquaintances and sources journalistically who have obviously know me and read the book, and they email me back and they say things like, I had no idea that this is what women had to go through and still go through today. I was clueless. And frankly, at the end of the day, the status of women will not advance further in American society, in particular in American big businesses, unless men and women both recognize this as something that is important for men to be committed to. And time again, that's what I heard from the women that I interviewed for the book. Yeah. And it's partly why I devote pretty much almost all of the last 2 chapters to the role that men play in trying to advance the status of women, because there have been a number of studies, and several of them have just come out this year, that have looked at what happens to profitability and return on equity at companies where there are a significant number of women in senior management and at companies where there are a significant number of women on corporate boards. And it does seem to be there's something called the diversity dividend, that having a more diverse management and having a more diverse board does make a difference in terms of companies' financial results. So to that extent, it's in men's interest as well as women to advance their cause. On the other hand, at one event that I did, and this was actually at my own employer, a colleague of mine spoke up about a man she knew who had been turned down repeatedly for employment at the Wall Street Journal, and he was told that the paper had hired a woman instead because they were trying to increase the ranks of women. And she felt that he was as qualified, if not more qualified. So, how would I answer that? She wanted to know.
How did you answer that?
I said to her, at the end of the day, we ought to be picking people on how well they perform and not on their gender. And it was an issue that Doug Conan, who I interviewed for the book, talked about in the book. Doug Conan is the former chief executive of Campbell Soup. He's one of 3 male champions of women that I write about in the very last chapter of the book. And he talks in that chapter about the fact that when he became CEO and had this eye-opening experience that was similar to some of the other men I was just talking about, and decided he wasn't doing enough in terms of fulfilling a commitment to advancing the status of women, to populate his senior management team with more women. And so he had already been CEO for a year or 2, but he then recruited another 3 women for his top team that had previously consisted of 1 woman and a dozen men. But as I point out in that chapter, this aggressive push that he's taking on behalf of women bothered some of his male colleagues, some of the male executives. Suddenly they felt like they were not as valuable to their CEO as the women. And so what he does is he tries to reassure them, but does not back down on his commitment to elevate women. And he tells these men, if you perform, there will be opportunities. And I think that at the end of the day is what it ought to be.
Yeah. One thing that came to mind when you were talking is I had the privilege of seeing Sheryl Sandberg speak in Boston, and she asked the audience, how many of you, it was, a handful of men, very few. And she said, how many of you men have ever been told in your job review hold it down. Don't speak up so much. And the guy sitting next to me said, why is she asking that question? And then a few minutes later, she said to the women, how many of you have been told, dial it down? And almost all of the women had raised their hand. And the guy next to me
wow.
went, he yelled out an expletive, not meaning to have it be so loud. And afterwards, he and I sat for a while. He was a millennial young man, and he said, I had no idea this is what the women in my workplace are going through. It was a very interesting moment. And also, you talk about the diversity dividend. I love that concept. And when I do my workshops on networking, one of the 7 elements I talk about is diversity, because if you have a same stock network and you have only people who look like you, talk like you, think like you, it can definitely get us into some problems. What are some other the stories of, some of the, women that you met? Was there did they all exercise in the morning? Did they meditate? Was there some habit that you felt you saw was a pattern for women to get productive? Because these days we're all so time-starved.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. Not one that I actually asked very many of them, but these were clearly women who did care a lot about staying, physically in shape, because when you're in a high-level management role, it's an extremely physically demanding role. And if you cannot be at the top of your game physically, then there's no way you can be at the top of your game mentally. But nevertheless, it is, particularly when you become a chief executive, something that is not for the faint-hearted. 2 of the women that I interviewed for the book suffered strokes at young ages, one in her 40s, and she had a second stroke a couple years later. The first stroke came just as she was about to take the company where she worked public. I mean, talk about bad timing. And Brenda Barnes, who was the CEO of Sara Lee and had a stroke at age 56, it actually occurred early in the morning when she was at her gym working out before she went to the office. And she literally fell off the exercise equipment because of the stroke and has never resumed working full time. So, it seems to me staying physically in shape is really important to be at the top of your game mentally. On the other hand, a number of these women, when they became working moms, found that a lot of their, sort of free time didn't exist anymore. And so friendships kind of had to take a back burner. I remember myself doing a first-person piece about being a working mom when I was a mother for the first time at the Wall Street Journal, and I wrote in this op-ed piece about the fact that all the plants had died since our baby had been born. But, at least the baby was doing fine. But I wasn't watering any plants.
Interesting. So I want to talk, it's always a dicey conversation to get into the election, but has there been response? I've talked to you before and after the election about how the book has been perceived or the questions that have come out of it as we're looking into a Trump administration, and how do women feel about their future under that leadership?
It obviously has definitely come up. I was in Chicago on Election Day speaking at the Executives Club. 850 people came to hear about the book, and 3 of the women I interviewed for the book were on a panel with me. And then over the course of the next 5 days, I was speaking also in California, and clearly the impact was humongous. But what I said to a number of these women, particularly when I got out into the tech sector in Silicon Valley, is, Hillary, was not elected. Clearly, if she had been elected, working women would have had an unprecedented champion in the White House for the first time in American history. It's not clear to me that Mr. Trump will be the same kind of champion of working women that Hillary probably would have been. But to me, it's said that whether it's in the workplace or in the political marketplace, this just increases the responsibility of women, particularly women who are in management roles and are supervising less experienced and more junior women, to be strong and outspoken advocates on behalf of working women, as well as to pay greater attention to their own career needs, because frankly, the responsibility is back on our shoulders. Or as my son said, who is a political figure in the Democratic Party in his state, he sent me an email the day after the election, and he said, as depressed as I am about the outcome of the election, I think this will sell more books.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conflicted feelings about how the stock market's going too. It's interesting. And actually, one little thing I'll share with you is that when Mary Barra became CEO of GM, I bought a few shares of stock, and I just would encourage I haven't made that a general practice. I'm trying to do it whenever I have a good speaking engagement and I have a few little extra dollars around. I'm just I think it would be a really interesting thing to do is just to put your money where your mouth is and support women by buying stock. Why not?
Well, and another thing though, another thing is the Washington Post did an article a few weeks after the election talking about the fact that millennial women were throwing their hats in the ring now who had supported Hillary's candidacy to run for local office, who had never ever thought about doing that before. And that same story pointed out that there was a similar sort of upsurge in political involvement after the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, when he was being considered for the Supreme Court, and everyone's eyes were open to an unprecedented degree to the presence of sexual harassment in the workplace. And I believe the story pointed out that in the next election, there were several more women elected to the U.S. Senate. So from a political standpoint, we could see that dividend.
In some cases, you got to start small. And I'll also just share a quick little story, is that I happened to see Anita Hill one time in the lobby of a hotel. And I froze, but I also just thought, I have to say something. I just have to say something. And I walked up to her and I just said, I just want to thank you for your courage. And she was so gracious and she was so appreciative. And it taught me to, I'm not someone who's particularly afraid of talking to people, but I was pretty taken back to, when I realized who I was walking by in the lobby and to say something. It was just really, she was very appreciative. She was very appreciative. One question has been written in here. What are a few key things that younger women starting out their careers can take away from today, especially those women that hope to get into leadership in the future?
Well, I think it's very important to have a clear game plan for what it is you want to achieve career-wise early in your career, and then make it clear to yourself that nothing is written in stone. And so at this law firm appearance I did a few weeks ago, a young woman raised her hand during the Q&A, and she said, I've just turned 30, I've just gotten married, my husband and I are trying to debate how quickly we should start trying to become parents. Should we wait 2 years? And also, how many years after that should we have the second child? In other words, she was trying to totally micromanage her entire life. And then she also wondered whether she should bring her boss into her confidence about her childbearing plans and how she was going to somehow, combine that with being an associate at this law firm. And so the response that I and the networking expert who was interviewing me, not Diane, unfortunately, but someone else, was, yes, of course, it's really good to have goals and career plans and have a framework for sort of where you're trying to go and what it is you need to do to get there. But at the same time, you have to recognize that life happens. Denise Morrison, who's one of the 52 women I interviewed for the book and was Doug Conan's successor at Campbell's Soup, is someone who took this idea to an extreme. I mean, she plotted her career progress very early on and throughout her career and kept track of not only sort of what she had done, but how many people she had supervised and, what responsibilities she had, and in terms of revenue, and she basically had this spreadsheet in which she was keeping track of how well she was doing and she had in mind from the time she was a very little girl that she wanted to be the head of a business. But again, things did not always go the way that she planned. And so she knew that as part of her career goal of becoming a CEO at some point, that she needed to get experience as being a corporate board member. She needed to get on a public company board. But yet it took her 8 years, okay, of trying before she got on a corporate board for the first time. And yet she had, at the point when she started pushing for this appointment, experience on a major nonprofit organization, a group called Leadership California, a statewide group for young women in California. And frankly, that ought to be a good way to leverage your experience, but it didn't work that way. And so when she was making the rounds with the recruiters to try and get on a public company board, at that point she was working for Kraft Foods. She was a vice president. She was running $1 billion a year business, which is pretty big business. And yet nobody wanted to take her seriously because they said corporate boards, that was true then. And frankly, it still remains true in many boardrooms today. We'd rather have an active chief executive of an entire company than someone who's simply running a business unit. It didn't matter how many billions or millions of dollars she was overseeing. And at one point, she challenges the recruiter saying, look at all these people that I supervise, look at the size of this unit. What is the difference between that and being CEO of a small company? And she didn't really get an answer. But all this sort of legwork in terms of making the rounds of several search firms did finally pay off. And 6 months later, a recruiter who she didn't know but worked at one of those search firms where she had visited sounded her out about joining the board of a Canadian company. And they wanted that Canadian company a board member who had sales and marketing in their background. And so she joins that Canadian company's board in 2002, and that then earns her the credibility, and that is very important for any woman who is trying to advance in her career. You have to earn respect, you have to earn legitimacy, and you have to earn credibility for what you can do. Having that experience on a public company board then allowed her to be seen as a potential candidate for a much bigger business. And so in 2005, she goes and becomes a board member at Goodyear Tire. And that's a full 6 years before she becomes CEO of Campbell Soup. Wow. But you know what? In hindsight, she said she didn't think she did it the right way. She didn't think she actually was very effective because it took her so long to get her first corporate board seat. And so here's what she says in the book. She said, I did it the hard way. If I was more savvy, I could have networked better by getting somebody to open a door for me. I didn't do that. Because networking is really key, whether it's getting on a corporate board or getting yourself exposed to other job possibilities. And that means you have to be networking outside of where you work. And Denise, I thought, put it really well. You have to think why you didn't get picked or why you should get picked for something, whether it's a higher level job where you work, a job at a new company, or getting on a board. And she said, you should never forget that, quote, you always know somebody who knows somebody who can open a door for you.
You're singing my song here because the way I define
I thought you would think that, Diane.
I loved it. No, seriously, but it's I define networking as building relationships before you need them. But the second part of the definition that really resonates with people is networking is the transference of trust. Mm-hmm. And often what I find is, the person who I call and say, hey, can you help me out? Can't. But they will know the person who I don't know, and they trust. And, and they use their relationship, their net bank, I call it in my book, to take out some of the money in the networking bank and say, hey, would you please meet with this person? I think it's worth your time. It's also why you want to be very mindful about being thoughtful about that.
But Diane, I think you should mention the name of your two books.
Oh, well, okay. So my two books are The Networking Survival Guide and Networking for Career Success, and they are both published by McGraw-Hill. And
can I add another point about networking, because it came up at another event where I was a few weeks ago. So I spoke at the Home Depot headquarters in Atlanta 2 weeks ago today, actually. And it was a session in their auditorium. They opened it up to, people not only who worked at corporate headquarters, but who worked at some of the nearby stores. They said we have 240 places, first come, first serve. Anyone who comes will get a free book. It sold out, quote unquote, because it was free, obviously. But in an hour, all the places were gone when they opened up the pre-registration. And during the Q&A afterwards, a young woman raised her hand and said, I stayed home with my kids for several years. I've recently come back into the workforce. I have, and I don't remember, I think it was 2 small children. I work very hard, and I know I also should be networking. But frankly, I don't have any time, to go out for drinks afterwards or to go, to networking events, before or after work. What would you propose, she asked me. Now, do you want to give the answer that I should have given, or do you want to hear what I told her?
No, I want to hear your answer, and then I'll have
to
chime in. So.
Well, my first thought was, where's Diane when I need her? And then I said something that I thought was helpful. I said to her, I totally understand where you're coming from. I am, the mother of 2 grown children. I certainly did not have any time to myself when they were young. But on the other hand, you know people, now that you've been in this company for a while, in lots of different areas in the company where they work for a boss who is clearly on the way up. Now, you cannot call their boss up and say, would you have a drink and get to know me, because you're way too far down in the food chain. But that doesn't mean, or have coffee with you or whatever, that doesn't mean you can't go out to lunch with these people in these other areas in your company as a way to get to know them and learn more about somebody who could be your sponsor. And you can do that during the workday. You don't have to do it before work or after work. You have to eat every day at lunchtime. Do your networking over lunch, but don't do it with the people that you work with all day. Do it with people who are in totally different areas than you, but are either an area that you would like to move into or where the person who's in charge of it is on the up and up. So that was my response. How did I do?
I think you did a great job. The other thing I often say to people is that it is very easy to diminish the mom network. And I think the mom network is incredibly powerful. And I think that these women, in many cases, are very talented, bright women. Just because they gave birth doesn't mean they lost their brain in the process. And in many cases, the women went to grad school with somebody, or they used to work with somebody. And so in many cases, I encourage them to really leverage the mom. And in one situation, someone jokingly called it the mom mafia. And it was a story of a stay-at-home dad who was trying to figure out how to appropriately fit in to the mom group. I mean, because he was the parent, but he was a stay-at-home dad. And it was harder for him to figure out how to navigate a little bit of that. And he finally found 1 or 2 women who were willing to embrace him and not think that he was, a scary person. He was just the parent of choice to stay home. But I think that women who are in that situation, there's no reason why they can't continue to excel professionally and network where they are.
Good point.
I find in many cases, and I also find in many cases it's, it's the people who, one woman got a job. It was a gentleman who was in my workshop a long time ago in Indianapolis, and his wife was looking for a job. And, and she was doing the networking, and it wasn't kind of working. And, and Indianapolis isn't a huge town, and so she came home one day and was belly aching to her cleaning lady that this wasn't, she was having a bad time, and she just really needed it to switch gears and wasn't quite sure. And the cleaning lady said, well, who else do you want to work for? And the woman was very thoughtful and kind and, didn't want to say, well, you're my cleaning lady. And she gave her a couple different companies and names. And the cleaning lady came back the following week and said, well, if you want to, I've set up an opportunity for you to be an interview, that they're happy to meet you. And the woman said, how do you know these people? She goes, I clean their house.
Wow.
And, I mean, so these people, they literally know where your dirt is, and so I think in many cases we get pretty, I don't know, not territorial, but we get projected on who is going to be of value to us and who is not going to be of value to us. And in some cases, I think particularly women, and I not have having had children myself, but I think it's easy for them to disparage that, when they're in that mode, that something is their value is somehow less. It's just different at the moment. So I would continue to tell them to network and stay in touch with that group.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice.
Yeah. I think it was a very compelling thing for me to experience. And this man called me up, and he was just so excited to tell me that, his wife, she got VP of sales and marketing through the cleaning lady. And because her target company, the woman cleans the CEO's house. So wow. You just, it's true. You really don't ever know, which is why you want to be very, thoughtful, polite, professional, kind, because you don't know who knows other people.
Right.
And actually, I think I remember one time when I was getting my hair cut that there's a new detective group, and for private detectives, and they only hire women with strollers because the women can hang around, take pictures, and they're actually taking pictures of somebody having an affair, doing something that they're not supposed to do, but nobody suspects the mom in the stroller.
Wow.
So, people get creative. Yeah. Let's talk before we wind up about pay disparity. There's been so much talk about this. There's been, a lot of public talk, about companies that we're going to make this equal. I know as a speaker that often I find out afterwards that the men speakers are paid more, so there's really no way for me to, find out.
You do find that out? Oh my God.
Oh, all the time. And I'm sad to tell you that the women's conferences are the worst. They always ask you to speak for free. And I have to explain this is what I do for food, and then they'll find somebody who will do it for free. And sometimes it doesn't. But
oh my gosh.
I just would be curious when you're really active about helping women with pay cap, and what are some ways to have those conversations, and what do you do when you discover you're underpaid? And I often feel like that, you're so valued here. I'm like, great, put $1 on it. What would you say to women who are in that situation, and as we wind up here?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we have to take responsibility for what we are paid, as well as obviously face situations in which the expectation is that we're not going to push back. And so the underlying theme in that chapter, which is called The Pain of the Pay Pinch, is if you don't ask, you don't get. And several of the women, that I interviewed for the book did find themselves in positions in which they didn't feel that they were being paid adequately. But rather than bitch and moan or swallow what was being offered to them without complaint, they did their homework, okay? They made sure they understood what they were getting into maybe the next time. They found out what people not only within their company in a similar role were making, but what people in other companies, perhaps in somewhat different roles but very similar responsibilities, were making. And so you can then decide whether it's worth making a fuss. Because as a rule, one of the HR women I interviewed for the book said, women are generally not paid the same as men who are in comparable roles, and it's partly because the women are not asking the right questions and are not coming in well prepared. And in one of the bullets at the end of that chapter, I make the point that just like I made the point that if you're not working for a leader that you respect, you should look for another position. You should be willing to jump ship if you're not getting paid fairly either. And so I quote Paula Rosbut Reynolds, who's been twice CEO of public companies, and she said, "Women are so damn loyal. Men threaten to leave and get raises to stay. Women just stay."
So I'm assuming people can get your book at local bookstores or online. Are you doing any book signings in the near future you want to share?
Sure. I'm doing a number of speaking appearances around the country. The ones that are coming up pretty soon are mostly in New York. I'll also be in Boston in January. A lot of these events, unfortunately, are not open to the public, but some of them are. And the ones that are open to the public are ones that people can learn about by going to my website, because the ones that are anyone who would like to attend, we're putting up on my website. I have a personal website, which is www.joannlublin.com. And you can also see there some of the places where I've already spoken.
Great, and I just also want to say that Vistage will be hosting another webinar on January 6th with Jeffrey Mortimer from Bank of New York. And we hope more of you will join us for that one. Any final thoughts, Joann, before we wind up?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you've got to believe in yourself more than anybody else, because no one is ever going to believe in you as much as you will.
Great. What a wonderful way to end it. Well, on behalf of myself, Diane Darling, and if you want some information about me, DianeDarling.com, or Vistage, or Joann, you can find information about us on the web. And I wish you all a wonderful Friday. Thank you so much.